Our preacher spent the whole dry summer of 1879 digging a great cellar under the floor of our church, with his own hands and the grudging help of a few boys. And the whole congregation was certain, and said so, that the man had lost his faith, because what did a preacher who truly trusted in God want with a hole in the ground to hide his flock in? We told him God would protect his own house. We told him the digging was a scandal and a want of faith. Some of us stopped coming to hear him preach over it. And then, on a green and terrible afternoon the next spring, the sky came down on our town, and it was the hole in the ground that the man of little faith had dug, and only that hole, that kept most of us alive, to be ashamed of every word we had said to him. We are the congregation of that church, or what is left of us who remember, and we are telling this together, because it is not a thing any one of us could tell alone without the shame of it stopping our mouths. It took the whole town to wrong that man, and it takes the whole town to set it right, and so we tell it together, as we did everything together in that place, the good and the bad both. You have to understand our preacher, and you have to understand what the plains could do, or none of it makes sense. Our preacher was a man named Elias Crane, not old, but grave beyond his years, and he had come to us from further east to shepherd our little town on the Kansas prairie, and we had loved him well enough in the ordinary way until the summer he began to dig. He was a man of deep and quiet faith. No one who knew him ever truly doubted that, though we said we did. His fault, if it was a fault, was of the opposite kind entirely from the one we accused him of, and we were too foolish to see it. And the thing he had come to understand about our country, that we who had lived there longer had let ourselves stop thinking about, because thinking about it was unbearable, was the particular horror of the plains in spring, which is the cyclone, the tornado, the twister, the great whirling storm that drops without warning out of a green and boiling sky and touches the earth and unmakes everything it touches, and then is gone, having killed some and spared others a stone's throw away, for no reason any man can name. We knew about tornadoes, of course. Every soul on that prairie did. But knowing and reckoning are two different things, and we had done the thing people do with a terror too large and too random to bear, which is to fold it away into the hands of Providence and think about it as little as possible. When a twister took a family on the far side of the county, we said it was God's will, and we were sorry, and we did not dig cellars, because to dig a cellar was to admit that it could be us, and to admit that was to live in a fear we could not carry. So we told ourselves that our fate was in God's hands, which was true, and used that truth to excuse ourselves from doing the one practical thing that might save us, which was not what the truth was for. Elias Crane would not do that, and that was the whole trouble between us. He looked at the same green springs we looked at, and he reckoned with what they could do, honestly, all the way, and he came to a conclusion that scandalized us. He concluded that a shepherd is responsible for his flock, in the body as well as the soul, and that a man who gathered 100 people into a wooden building every Sunday in cyclone country, and had made no provision to save their lives if the sky came down on them during the sermon, was not being faithful, he was being negligent, and dressing his negligence up as faith. And so he set out to dig, under the church where his people gathered, a cyclone cellar, deep and strong enough to hold the whole congregation, a place to go down into when the sky turned green. And he could not understand why we did not thank him, and we could not understand why our preacher had so little faith that he needed a hole in the ground. Here is the thing about Elias Crane that we all remarked on that summer, and mocked, and that turned out to be the truest thing about him. And it was not an object, it was a way he had. He watched the sky while he preached. All that spring and summer, as the digging went on and the quarrel with it, we noticed that our preacher, in the very act of preaching, would let his eyes go to the windows, to the west, again and again, a quick glance westward in the middle of a sentence, all through the service, and we took it for distraction, or worse, for the sign of a man whose mind was on his digging and his fear instead of on the Word. And some said it showed he thought more of his hole than his heaven. We did not understand that the man was doing, even in the pulpit, the two halves of his calling at once, tending our souls with his voice and guarding our lives with his eyes, watching the west the way a shepherd watches the edge of the wood, because he had appointed himself the one who would see it coming. And he never once, all those months, let a service pass without keeping that watch. And we thought it was faithlessness, and it was the most faithful thing in that whole church. What Elias Crane understood, and what we had hidden from ourselves under a false and lazy piety, was a truth about that country and about God both, and it is a truth worth the whole telling. He understood that the tornado gives no warning worth the name, that from the time you can be sure it is coming to the time it arrives may be a minute or two and no more, and that in that minute there is no time to do anything except the thing you have already prepared to do. You cannot outrun it, and you cannot outguess it, and you cannot, once it is upon you, do anything at all except be, already, in a strong place below the ground, or die. And so the only protection on the whole earth against it is the cellar dug beforehand, in the calm, when there is time, and the plan drilled beforehand of how the people will get into it fast when the sky turns. And he understood the other thing, the thing that was really the quarrel between him and us, which was that preparing for disaster is not a failure of faith, but a form of love, that the God he served had given men hands and minds precisely so that they might provide for one another, and that to sit in the path of a known danger and make no provision, calling your idleness trust, was not faith at all, but a kind of blasphemy, the burying of the talent, the tempting of the Lord your God. He used to say that God had not told us to be careless. He said, "Providence gave me a strong back and a warning sky. It would be a poor thanks to use neither." He said it to us plainly the once, when the quarrel was at its worst, and some of the elders came to rebuke him for the scandal of the digging. And he did not bend to them, which we held against him then, and bless him for now. They told him his cellars showed the town he did not trust God to protect the church. And Elias Crane said, "I trust God to protect your souls." He was quite calm about it. "Your bodies he has given into my care, and I will not answer to him some day for 100 people dead in a heap of lumber I could have dug them a shelter from." And he took up his spade again, and the elders went away angry, and the digging went on, and we did not understand that we had just been told the deepest kind of faith there is, the kind that rolls up its sleeves. Now the church was not of one mind, and it would be false to tell it as though the whole town scorned him and he stood alone, for a few saw the sense of it and helped, some boys who liked the digging, and a few families who had lost kin to twisters and did not need convincing. But most of us held back, and here I must tell the honest and shameful part, the part where our pettiness nearly cost us the very thing that saved us. For the quarrel grew bitter enough that it split the congregation, and there was a faction that not only would not help, but wanted the digging stopped, wanted the cellar filled back in, called it a standing insult to God under his own floor, and there was a real chance that summer that they would prevail, that the board would order Crane to quit and undo his work, and had they done so, we would have had no shelter when the day came. What saved the cellar was not that the town came to its senses. It did not. What saved it was that Elias Crane simply would not stop, that he bore the anger and the falling attendance and the loss of some of his people's regard, and kept digging, kept shoring the walls with good timber, and stocking the place with water and lamps, kept it ready, absorbing the whole town's displeasure into his own patient back, rather than give up the thing he knew would save us. His stubbornness, that we called pride and worse, was the only reason the shelter existed on the day we needed it. And if he had been a more agreeable man, a man who bent to his congregation's wishes, we would most of us be dead. By that next spring, the cellar under the church was finished, deep and dry and strong, timbered and benched and stocked, with a wide stair down from inside the church and a slanting door from outside, big enough for the whole congregation and more. And we will tell you honestly how it sat with the town, for the shame is the point. It sat like a rebuke and an embarrassment. It sat there under our worship, like a monument to our preacher's peculiar fear, and we were tired of it, and tired of the quarrel, and many of us had made a kind of sullen peace with the thing only by ignoring it, stepping over the cellar door on our way to the pews, and not thinking about the green afternoons at all. And the digging had cost Elias Crane a good part of the love his town had borne him, and he knew it, and dug and stocked and readied all the same, and watched the west, and waited, and preached to a smaller flock than he had once had, and never said a bitter word to us about any of it. The spring came on wet and warm and heavy, the kind of spring the old plainsman watched with narrowed eyes, and on a Sunday in the last of it, with the congregation gathered and Elias Crane in the pulpit, the west went green. He saw it before any of us, because he was watching, as he always watched, even in the pulpit, even mid-word. We were listening to the sermon, or half listening, the way a congregation does, and we saw our preacher stop in the middle of a sentence and go still, his eyes on the west windows, and we felt the light in the church change, go strange and yellow-green and thick, and the air went dead. And then we heard it, the sound they all speak of who have heard it and lived, the sound like a great train bearing down where there was no railroad, the roar of the thing that was already coming and would arrive in a minute or less. And Elias Crane did not freeze, and he did not cry out, and he did not pray, not then. He did the thing he had prepared for a year to do. He said, in a voice that filled the church without panic in it, "The cellar, now, everyone, quickly," the way he had said it in the drills we had grudgingly practiced. And he came down out of the pulpit and opened the cellar door, and he put his people down into the ground. The tornado did not care that it was the Lord's day, or that it was the Lord's house, or which of us had mocked the hole and which had dug it. It came the way they come, for everyone in its path, the faithful and the faithless together. And this is the part we can hardly tell, even now, even together. And we will tell it plainly, because Elias Crane would want no lie told to spare us. He got us down, the whole congregation, near 100 souls, down the stair into the deep timbered cellar in the space of a minute or two, because we had drilled it, however sullenly, and our bodies knew the way even as our minds were white with terror. The children handed down, the old ones half carried, Elias Crane at the door counting us through with his hands and his voice, steady as a shepherd at a gate. And he came down last and pulled the door to, and in the dark and the packed, warm-breathing fear of that cellar, we heard the sky take our church. It took it whole. The sound of it above us was the end of the world, a roar and a shrieking and a rending, and the floor of the church, which was the roof of our shelter, groaned and shuddered, and dust and splinters rained down between the boards, and some of us screamed, and some of us prayed, and the children clung to us, and above our heads, in a few seconds, the tornado tore the entire church building off its foundation and flung it across the prairie in pieces. The pulpit and the pews and the roof and the walls, the whole house of worship scattered and gone. And we sat in the ground beneath where it had been and lived, every one of us, near 100 souls, in the cellar our preacher had dug against our will, while the church came apart in the air above us. When it had passed, and Elias Crane judged it safe and pushed open the door, we came up out of the ground into a world swept bare. Where our church had stood, there was nothing but the stone foundation and the open cellar mouth we had climbed from. And all around, the wreckage, and the strange, scoured silence that comes after. We were alive. All of us who had been in that church were alive because we had been below the ground when the sky came down. And there is no other reason at all, and we knew it standing there, every one of us who had called that hole a scandal. We must make the plain sense of it clear, because it is the whole hard truth of that country, and it is why we tell this. There is no fighting a tornado, and there is no fleeing it, and there is no praying it away once it is come. Men better and more faithful than any of us have died in its path with prayers on their lips. For it is not a judgment on the wicked, it falls on the just and the unjust exactly alike, randomly, terribly, and the only thing on God's earth that reliably saves a life from it is to be below the ground when it passes. That is all. A hole in the ground, dug beforehand, in the calm, when there is time, and the sense and the drill to get into it, in the 1 minute of warning the sky gives you. Elias Crane had understood that, and had understood too that seeing this truth and acting on it was not a betrayal of his faith, but the truest expression of it. That the God who gave him a strong back and eyes to watch the west meant him to use them to guard the lives put in his keeping, and that trust in providence was never meant to be an excuse for leaving undone the things a man's own hands could do. He had not doubted God by digging. He had served God by digging, had loved his people in the most practical and least sentimental way there is, by making sure that when the worst came, as on the plains it always eventually comes, there would be a strong place in the ground for them to be. And we had called it faithlessness, because we preferred a piety that asked nothing of our backs to a faith that asked us to dig. But we promised to tell it whole, and the whole of it is not only our deliverance, and here is the grief that sits under this story, and always will, and Elias Crane carried it the rest of his life. The cellar saved everyone who was in the church. It could not save everyone in the town. That same tornado, in the same few minutes, tore across our little settlement, and it did not take only the church, it took houses, and it took people who were not with us that Sunday, who were home, who had no cellar because the whole town had followed the whole town's foolishness, and not only our preacher's wisdom. A family at the edge of town, who had quarreled with Crane over the digging and stayed home that day partly out of that quarrel, was lost, most of them, in their house, a stone's throw from where they might have been safe below our floor. Children we knew. And Elias Crane, who had saved 100, had to preach their funerals and stand over the small graves of people who had died in part because they had believed the very thing he had spent a year trying to talk the town out of. And he never once, in those funerals or after, said a word of "I told you so," or let anyone else say it in his hearing. But we who watched him knew that he carried those graves, that being right had bought him no peace at all, only the particular anguish of the man who saw the danger and could not make enough people believe him in time. That is the bitterest part of true wisdom on a hard frontier, that being proved right is so often indistinguishable from grief, that the prophet who is heeded saves 100, and the ones who would not hear him fill the graveyard, and he must live having done both at once. We rebuilt the church, of course, and I will tell you the first thing we did before we raised a single wall. We did not fill in the cellar. We deepened it and strengthened it, and built the new church squarely over it, larger, with the shelter beneath. And we drilled our children in the getting down quick until they could do it in their sleep, and no one in that town ever again called it a want of faith to dig a hole against the sky. The thing Elias Crane had been scorned and nearly driven out for became simply the way our town lived, the way every sensible town in that country came in time to live, with a strong place in the ground and the humility to use it. And the mockery was never spoken again, and the shame of having spoken it stayed with us who had, and taught us. Elias Crane preached to us many more years in the new church over the good, deep cellar, and he was, if anything, a graver man after, for he had learned the weight of being right. But he never turned bitter, and he never turned boastful, and he never stopped watching the West, even from the pulpit. And now, when his eyes went to the windows mid-sermon, we did not think it faithlessness. We thanked God for it, for we had learned what that watching was. He would say, when younger preachers asked him about the famous cellar, that a man's faith and a man's shovel were not enemies, and had never been, that the Lord was honored as much by the roof you built well and the shelter you dug deep as by any prayer, more, maybe, because the prayer cost you only words, and the digging cost you your sweat and your neighbor's good opinion. And he would say, more quietly, to those who knew the whole story, that he would trade all the vindication he ever got for the few he could not save, and that a man should dig his cellar and drill his children, not so that he can be proved right, which is ashes, but so that on the day the sky falls, there are simply fewer empty chairs, which is the only thing that matters, and the only thing worth a single hour of the labor. We are old now, the last of that congregation, and the town is bigger, and the second church is old itself, and the cellar is still beneath it, still ready, still used when the West turns green, as it still does and always will in that country. People hear this story and think it is about a clever preacher who dug a hole, and it is, but the heart of it is the thing he taught us at such cost, that trusting God and providing wisely are not opposites, but the same duty seen from two sides, and that the deepest love a person can show the people in their keeping is the unglamorous, doubted, back-breaking work of preparing, in the calm, bright days, the strong place that will hold them when the terrible day comes. The sky will fall someday, wherever you are. If not this sky, then another. Dig the cellar, drill the children, bear the mockery of those who call your care a want of faith. And pray, yes, pray with your whole heart, but pray like Elias Crane, who prayed on his knees and dug with his hands and watched the West with his eyes and saved 100 souls and grieved the ones he could not, and taught a foolish town that the shovel and the psalm were always, always meant to work together. Now, this congregation and their preacher are ours, but here is what is true. The tornado is the deadliest and most sudden of the storms of the American plains, striking with only minutes of warning or less, unfightable and unpredictable, sparing one house and destroying its neighbor for no reason anyone can find. The one proven protection has always been the storm cellar or cyclone cellar, a strong shelter dug below ground beforehand, reached in the brief warning the sky gives, and such cellars became, and remain, standard and life-saving across tornado country, along with the drilled habit of getting into them fast. Whole congregations and families were saved by them, and lost for the want of them, exactly as told here. And the deepest wisdom of the story is real and old, that prudent preparation is not a failure of faith, but a form of responsibility and love, and that against the disasters which strike too fast to answer, only what is built and readied in the calm can save a life. The town and Elias Crane are imagined. The green sky, the cellar, and the hard truth that the shelter must be dug before the storm are exactly as they were.